Welcome, everybody, and welcome to our first Oralities event of the term. My name is Christina Woolner, and I'm one of the conveners of the Oralities Research Network at CRASSH, which is a Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at Cambridge. And I'm also a research associate in the Department of Social Anthropology here at Cambridge. And for those of you who are new to these events, the Oralities Network is an interdisciplinary research network that brings together scholars and practitioners concerned with investigating, debating, and understanding practices of audition, broadly conceived. And we hold events bi-weekly during term time. Today, we're going to be investigating this theme through a discussion of sound archives. And we're lucky to have panelists joining us from a number of different continents, spanning 12 hours, I think. And they're going to be talking about their varied work in some pretty diverse settings. And between them, they've worked in archives in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and the UK as anthropologists and ethnomusicologists, but also as sound curators, and in one case, as a music producer. So as a social anthropologist who does research on music, sound archives occupy a complicated space in my own discipline. And part of my own interest in organizing this event was to think through what that place is. And since the advent of recording technology, anthropologists and ethnomusicologists have made field recordings that very often end up in archives far removed from the communities where they were gathered. On the one hand, the very sounded and oral nature of these archives have led some to suggest that these archives represent unique sources of knowledge and that they might allow us to hear otherwise forgotten voices speaking for themselves rather than represented in the writing of others. Archives made by researchers, of course, are not the only kinds of archives. And in fact, I started my own PhD research in a sound archive in Hargeisa, Somaliland, that was developed and maintained by a local cultural center who had amassed an impressive collection of cassettes, many of which have been scattered by war and that eventually regathered together and cataloged. And it was actually in that archive that I met Vic, one of our panelists. In both cases, though, how these archives speak and are heard, for whom and to what effect, cannot be separated from complicated questions of disciplinary and colonial power dynamics. And today our panelists are going to each reflect on the political, epistemological, and ethical challenges and opportunities of engaging with these archives, while also considering if it even makes sense to talk about decolonizing such spaces. So just a few notes about how the event will run. I'll have the panelists briefly introduce themselves, and then they're going to each speak for about 10 minutes. We will have about 10 or 15 minutes for discussion or debate between them, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. The first part of the event will be recorded, but the audience Q&A section will not be. I also, unfortunately, need to be the bearer of some bad news at the outset. And that news is that Sylvia won't be able to join us today as she's been thwarted by an internet blackout in Uganda following the election. And we weren't able to figure out a way to get her connected to Zoom. So I would encourage everyone to look at her research if you've not yet done so, and I'm sure she would love to hear from people if you would like to know more about what she does. Just a few logistical things. I would ask that everyone keeps themselves on mute until we get to the Q&A portion of the event. If you would like to ask a question, you can either use the raise hand function or type your question in the chat. There are a lot of you, but we will do our best to try and take questions as they come. And also feel free to use the chat throughout the presentation if you want to make comments or ask questions in the moment, and we'll attempt to address them later on. And we also keep a record generally of those chats if people want to refer back to anything there. All right, so I think that's all that I'm going to say for now. We'll briefly just have each of the speakers say hello so you can see them. And then we're going to start with Aaron. All right.
So we're going to go around and introduce and then talk?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Aaron Fox. I'm at Columbia University, been there 24 years. And in 2003, I became in charge of Columbia's Center for Ethnomusicology Sound Archive. So that's the capacity in which I'm here. I'm in snowy Western Massachusetts, and it's great to see a bunch of people who I've worked with on these projects over the years signed up here. So thanks for having me, Christine.
Thanks. Noel, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, hi, many thanks, Christina. Thanks for the initiative. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Vic. Thanks all. Yeah, thanks for being here. My name is Noel. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia, where it's very cold. I come from the world of professional arts, music industry, radio, DJing, events, and then I trained as a sound curator and ethnomusicologist, and worked at Oxford in music and anthropology in the Pitt Rivers Museum, and have been in Virginia in the music department for the last 6 years. It's really nice to see you all. So thanks for being here.
Sure. Vic?
Hi, I'm Vic Sohonie. I'm joining you from Bangkok, Thailand in Southeast Asia. I'm the founder of Ostinato Records, which is a Grammy-nominated record label. We've released music from Haiti, Senegal, the Cape Verde Islands, Somalia, and Djibouti, and hopefully in the pandemic, a lot more countries. Can everyone hear me? Sorry, I thought I said, yeah, okay.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. I'm also on the editorial board of the Boycott Times, as well as a contributor to africaasaCountry.com, a website, a critical website that many of you may know, where I actually wrote an article that was republished into a few languages in Europe, into European newspapers, about what I believe is the model going forward to work with historical African music. And I hope that I can discuss some of that here today. So thank you all for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you, everybody. All right. Aaron, we will turn things over to you.
So I have 9:41 my time, so I'll try to keep it to 9:51. So I didn't write anything here because in a way the topic and the questions, addresses everything I've been thinking about on the professional side of my life for 17 years or something. So the problem is usually figuring out where to enter the fray. Since there's a big crowd here, it looks like about 160 odd people, 180 people. Wow. I think it's best to keep it, really basic to start with. So I'll briefly just say in 2003, I got put mostly because I was the only person interested in doing it, in charge of a collection of sound recordings in an archive at Columbia University, most of which were made by the sort of interesting mid-century American music collector Laura Bolton, who had sold her collection, and importantly for anything I say, sold her collection, meaning physical copies of her recordings that she had made on 5 continents over the course of 40 odd years, but also sold a bundle of purported claimed intellectual property rights in her collection to my university. So in 2003, I inherited the management of this collection, and it quickly threw up a series of challenges that have kept me engaged, the last 18 years. Most important of which, from my own point of view, was a really significant amount of indigenous North American, Native American, and Alaska Native, especially Canadian First Nation materials recorded in the 1930s and 40s by Bolton, much of which had never been attended to in any way with an eye towards questions of the ethics of possession and control and ownership and repatriation, which in 2003, it seems, amazing to say that, was a novel idea in the world of sound archives. One of our guests here, Anthony Seeger, I noticed is on the call, quite literally pioneered this entire area of thinking and deeply influenced me when I took on this responsibility and realized, quickly the size of it, and that it was going to outlast me in my mortality and in my professional career, to try to sort through and undo the accumulated ethical damage that had been done in the history of this collections movement, from encounters this collector had in the field under all kinds of conditions, but many of which can only be characterized as exploitative at best, coercive at worst, generally unfair and structured in dominance in every case. How that wound up, changing hands, becoming a collection, becoming a body of work that could then be assigned intellectual property status and monetary value and purchased by a university, which, if you've read my papers on this subject, is a side story I won't tell now about the university's interest having nothing to do with the sound collection. Laura Bolton was the girlfriend of the university's oldest and one of its wealthiest alumni in the 1960s, and the university bought her collection to appease the soon to pass away rich alumnus. And so the problem was acquired unethically from the beginning. I've written about that in a couple of articles. That's an interesting side story. But the history is really of these recordings is really dirty and complicated and messy, and beginning to unravel it, like a lot of people, I went into it thinking in rather binary terms about the justice and ethics questions around this stuff, especially because I was immediately confronted when I took over the collection by a Diné Navajo family who had a really serious family stake in this archive. Great-grandfather, famous medicine man who had recorded for Laura Bolton under coercive conditions at the Century of Progress exposition in Chicago in 1933. Working with that family as my first ever repatriation project, instantly, nothing's instant, but in very short order, led me to realize that sort of that the work of unwinding the histories of these sounds on tape, or on digital files, in the way we've worked with them mostly, was nonlinear and relational and not transactional, and led me over the years of working with that family and that collection to about a dozen or so other repatriation projects, most of which have been in Native American and Alaska Native context, and many of which have been in partnership with people who are here today. So I'm going to call out two in particular. Blair Mosner-Feltham, who is on this call, was an undergraduate student at Barnard in 2003, and was literally my right hand in my first several years of doing this work. So hi, Blair. And Chia Sakakibara is on this call. She's at Oberlin College, where she's a professor of geography and environmental studies. And as some people on the call know, Chia and I have worked collaboratively in Alaska on a repatriation project since 2007. Is that right? I think that's right, or 2008. Anyway, 13 years or something like that. And her book just came out, and I can't recommend it enough. It does actually intersect in various ways with our work together, although it's mostly about her work on climate change and human geography. It's called Whale Snow. Just came out, University of Arizona Press. So hi, Chia. I'm actually a little tongue-tied by the people who are in the audience here. Knowing some of them know very great details about all this history, and some of you have no idea. I want to focus just for a few more minutes, because I'm down to a couple minutes, on sort of the tail end of all this, which is what I've been doing the last year or so, which grows out of Chia's and my work on the North Slope of Alaska with the Inupiaq community to repatriate. What that means, I've written a lot about. It isn't as simple as handing things over at all. And together, Chia and I really developed a kind of model of what we call ethnographic repatriation, or community-based repatriation, in the community of Utqiagvik, North Slope of Alaska. Through that work, and actually through Chia and my Chia's friend, Henry Huntington, who's a geographer of the Arctic, I got connected. I was going to show you the photo on share screen, but time is short. I don't know if you can kind of see that photo, to this guy whose name is George Nungawuk. George is an elder and whaling captain of Savunga, Alaska, on St. Lawrence Island in the Bering Strait. Siberian Yupik community of about 800 people, one of two main villages on St. Lawrence Island. The other is Gamble. It's slightly smaller, also Siberian Yupik. From years and years now of working with ancient analog sound collections, ancient by sound recording terms, that have been separated from and unknown by their communities. This new project has flipped me over in a different direction, which was George Nungawuk, who is also a leader of the dance group and keeper of the song tradition in Savunga, had reached out to his friend Henry Huntington to say, Henry, I'm getting up there, and our community is quite poor and doesn't have a heritage apparatus or infrastructure or heritage center or even a place to go to, put things or store things that we have. And I've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these. C60 digital cassette. This one's broken, which is why I have it. We're trying not to take them out of Alaska otherwise. And quite a few of these SD cards and a bunch of old laptop computers around full of digital video and photographs and stuff I shot. And I got no way to deal with this. It's in boxes in my overcrowded house, getting dusty, falling apart. And on those recordings are 50 years of history of the dance traditions and music traditions of Savunga. Unlike the North Slope of Alaska Inupiaq community, we don't have oil money. We don't have a heritage center or cultural heritage apparatus. We got nothing in that domain. We have a lot of walruses. But anyway, so George reached out and said, I need you to come here and help me do this thing, which is to convert, digitize, preserve, and archive all of my stuff. So I actually just a year ago today or this week, I was in Savunga working with George for the first time, and the pandemic has completely interrupted this project, which is funded by the National Science Foundation now. But the ambitious goal is eventually to do the entire community's archive and then leave it in their control. At the University of Alaska, there's no place in Savunga that could do this, but in Alaska and under pretty tight community control. So just to think about this sort of full circle of, I spent a lot of the last 20 years thinking about, what to do with this legacy of recordings that has accumulated this unethical pall, right, of just enormous complexity to undo. And then to start another cycle of producing stuff, right, in the same time. But in terms of the themes of this conversation, I really want to stress the question of agency and, the active work of decolonizing, not being a state, but a state of mind. I've been super influenced, I think a lot of people on this call have, by Dylan Robinson's new book, Hungry Listening, which is a way to think about indigeneity as a listening subjectivity and non-indigeneity in relation to indigeneity. It's an amazing book, and it's been really shaping my thinking for the last few months. And so I've been trying to think about the limits of thinking about the archive as the agent, is the shortest way to put it, as the site of action and practice from which we launch social justice initiatives, given the lack of that agency sort of traveling all the way up the institutional pathways to the real centers of power in institutions, especially. That we should be careful about the kind of grand claims of decolonization unless they involve sort of radical rethinking of where initiative and agency comes from and who we serve. And I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say about Savunga, but I'm happy to do that in the questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Aaron. We will hear from Noel next.
Yeah, many thanks. Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Aaron. So, yeah, as the person going in the middle here, I've long been inspired by the type of work Aaron's doing, and he name checks Tony and many other people in the room here. And I mentioned to Christina, I first spoke at CRASSH over a decade ago about early versions of this work on the political lives of documents, a session which was really instrumental to help think through histories, etc. I'm also really inspired by what the kind of professional music world brings to these kind of questions. So it's great to learn more recently about Vic's work. And what I'd like to do just for the next 10 minutes or so is I'm going to screen share, and I have a handful of images for us and one very brief 1 minute clip that I'm going to build towards. Includes a couple of quotes, but I'd like to build a structure around that for us and explain some projects and artistic interventions that have happened across the last decade or more. So allow me to just screen share. If there's any problem, a message will get through to me, I know. Okay, so I'm gonna just screen share through Google Slides here. The work I'd like to talk about, which is really kind of artistic interventions in and around sound archives, will be published as a book called Sound Fragments from Field Recording to African Electronic Stories next year. And the question I kind of set myself in a way is what stories, removals and personal pathways can be found, heard and imagined when listening to archival ethnographic recordings. How can curators excavate around the recordings? Inspired by Roshanak Keshti's work on This is Modernity's Ear, the phonographer's listener, a kind of placeholder for a future listener, and we can't always be certain who and where those requests or possibilities come from. I'm going to build towards one of my main collaborative partners, the Black Power Station in Makanda in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. It's an independent intergenerational arts education space developed by visionary artist Xolile Madinda. It sees itself as a liberated space. The Black Power Station is a reclaimed former power station that used to serve only the white side of town in Makanda in South Africa. It's now decayed and has been reclaimed by art. And on their website, which is currently in progress, the banner reads Siqala Apple Bayeka Corner, we start where they ended. It's very much about foregrounding local indigenous Xhosa histories and modes of thinking, being and acting. The main sort of colonial archive that I'm going to talk about is the International Library of African Music, or ILAM. I know many of you here know all about this, set up by Hugh Tracy, an Englishman, and who recorded much of sub-Saharan Africa, made a wonderful collection, which is currently owned by Rhodes University in the Eastern Cape of South Africa. X is here down at the bottom, and he has a complicated relationship to ILAM. He both likes and dislikes the place. He wants access to the content. He felt years ago distance from it. He felt like this includes our heritage and it doesn't belong to us. The thing that makes me angry about ILAM, said X, is it makes it look like we choose to forget. So he feels the mode of presentation in an institutional archive can sometimes overlook the agency and make it look like local communities chose to forget. He's also now currently on the advisory board to ILAM and is able to help drive projects moving forward. So, I'm interested in his relationship from outside to inside and then building his own archives. And I'm going to move towards this event, Graham's Legacy, Makanda's Future, hosted at the Black Power Station in 2018, which was a remarkable coexistence of different competing histories in an art space. I mentioned that I come from the world of professional arts and then trained as a curator and ethnomusicologist. This was through the Pitt Rivers Museum and Anthropology and Music back in Oxford, UK, and was very inspired by working with curators who are mainly working with objects and images and gallery spaces, but to think about how we apply this to sound. So we were encouraged to think of objects as active, This is Mavungu and Kizia Congolese nail fetish, which in the Pitt Rivers Museum looks like a piece of art behind a glass cabinet, but it's actually an active object. You drive nails in to make things happen. So with that in mind, started to kind of develop frames thinking like this to apply to sound, built a series called Sound Galleries, which was immersive soundscapes within the gallery spaces, but designed to explore some of the properties in sound archives, the music in sound archives, like in this case with a Bayaka soundscape, music from the Central African Republic, rainforests, music and movement, music in the dark, music as participation. So trying to kind of unleash MP3s and WAV files into something more experiential again, raise awareness of a marginalized community, and to stream and make it available for those that want to listen via satellite phone, etc. This led to a series called Cape Sound Stories, which was commissioned in Berlin at a festival called Pop 16, where we're invited to work through some recordings from almost 100 years ago, South African recordings, including the first ever recording of Nkosi Sikelel' Afrika, the South African national anthem, recorded by Sol Plaatje. And these recordings are at Wits University Archive. We listened together with a range of artists, including the remarkable Andile Velem, a choreographer based in Cape Town, who's been deaf since the age of 5, listened to these archival fragments and reimagined stories that could be told. And this led to a 30-minute choreographed performance in the Round in a black box theatre in Berlin, retelling stories inspired by archival fragments. It included communication through vibrations and taking very small archival moments and amplifying them to vibrate to the stage and communicate with Andile and other artists. And I'm sure we're all fully aware that curationism is everywhere. Does it even mean anything anymore now that we're all curators? You know, is there any precision anymore from something that used to be about control of knowledge? And is curation going into more collective, deconstructed, kind of shared platforms? With this in mind, I've been really interested in work in and through and beyond the International Library of African Music, based, as I said, in now Makanda or Grahamstown, Makanda, South Africa. A colonial archive, salvage ethnography, you know, perceived musical cultural forms that were perceived to be under assault and recorded by an outsider. And the key take-home lesson I was taught more than a decade ago by Xolile, who you can see here on the left, and Nyaki on the right, was if people are intimidated or outside of archives, institutional archives, or don't feel like it's theirs, you can take the archive to people, take it to the streets. So here in Fingo Village Township, taking fragments on tapes, talking to elders to see if it matters, to see what stories get unleashed. And this mode went into taxis, schools, bars, everywhere, back in sort of more public and communally owned spaces in many cases. And this method really inspired me and stayed with me, kind of a local ownership of an archive. Mngani, a poet, talking to young kids outside Joza Public Library while playing colonial recordings alongside hip hop, raga, kwaito, house, contemporary soundscapes to see what conversations might be possible. And as Christina and Aaron have already introduced, you know, like what is the limits of the archive and who are recordings for? I'm sure it's something that everyone here is thinking through in their own ways. This is an image from the Tracy collection, a kind of inspection mode through sound. Through various projects related to ILAM, I've been involved as a part-time consultant to International Remix Project, the Beating Heart Project, based in both London and Nairobi, had access to ILAM's recordings and been remixed by international and local artists, really aimed at the kind of metropolitan house festival scene, not without its problems, but has generated very real benefit, school buildings, nutrition programs. So it's been interesting to see the role or relationship of the very well-connected professional music industry to an archival, a colonial archive collection. But what I'm most interested in for the last few minutes here is local also responses in the Eastern Cape to a colonial archive. What do people want to do and say about an archive, and how are people also conceivably building their own archives through and beyond colonial archives? So back to this Graham's Legacy Makanda's Future event, put together and hosted in 2018 at the Black Power Station, a truly remarkable space. Grahamstown, originally named after the colonial butcher of the place, a decimator of Xhosa culture, was recently renamed Makanda after a Xhosa warrior and hero. And as we see all over the globe, this created a lot of contestation, a lot of debate, a lot of anger as well, a lot of pride and anger. There's the Keep Grahamstown movement. And, you know, there's contested, whose histories are we talking about here? The response to the Black Power Station was to create an artistic name change discussion where they threw things into the mix, like some of Tracy's recordings. They then had praise poets, sound artists, drama, hip hop, everything in the work. And also, in the remarkable moment that I took home from being at this event, I was there for an entire month in 2018, was seeing two different competing histories meet each other live in this space. An American academic gave a generous lecture on Makanda, who Makanda was, based on a book that's been written, which is itself based on archival sources. And as this lecture finished, there was hundreds of people here. There was like kids from the schools, artists, etc. The moment the lecture on Makanda finished, about who Makanda was, Tandazili Madinda, a praise poet, an Imbongi, leapt up from the audience and roared in isiXhosa, in this Isibongo style, this praise poetry style, which is very powerful. It shakes the walls, it shakes the bones, and basically shook the hand of the lecturer and then spoke in Xhosa and said, these are our histories. We know how to keep our histories. We've been doing this before the books. We have our own mode. Let's keep interrogating our sources. Let's keep our stories alive. It was a truly remarkable moment seeing these different competing histories, not necessarily competing, but different modes of approaching history, internal, external, meet each other live in an art space that was creative. It wasn't echo chamber. It wasn't hostile in any way. And I didn't really know at the time, but I kind of realized, having since this event, spent more time with like the work of Toyin Falola from the Palgrave Handbook of African Social Ethics on this examination of ritual archives. And the quote here from Falola's chapter towards the end of the volume, if you haven't seen it, why ritual archives are important. This was a ritual archive we were seeing happen in the Black Power Station. I just didn't know it was, I hadn't heard the term at that point. But the kind of things that archives quite often miss, or traditional archives, there's different forces, invisible forces, etc. And how can they be activated? For those that don't know Falola's work, he also explores this idea of pluriversalism, the refusal to follow any particular hegemonic or dominant form of history keeping. And so I'm just going to finish now with a very short, this is a 1-minute clip from a series developed by the Black Power Station called Lost Conversations. The first version of this, which is a visual play. It happened online during the National Arts Festival last year, when the world contracted into Zoom. It would have been in person, but it went online. It's a play filmed by candlelight, soundscapes, and based on both archival and oral histories, all remixed and imagined by local artists to interrogate who was Makanda. And this first version reimagines Makanda as a military genius, which is not how he's typically been presented in the archives. So I'm just going to play a 1-minute clip so you get a sense of it. This on the right here is actually Tandazili Madinda, who was the same praise poet who got up and challenged, if you like, the academic lecture on Makanda. So this is a 1-minute clip to finish. And the thing that probably doesn't come through Zoom is that this includes the burning of mpepo, a kind of incense. Tracy's recordings are in the mix here, colonial recordings are in the mix, and then a kind of a reimagination of archival sources, oral histories collected by people and then reperformed as a play and circulated. This is planned as a series, and this is just a promo from the first episode.
On my way in Hlonipheki, I met Ukwinwoho.
Makanda and his right-hand man, his war general, his trusted military advisor, are planning an attack of Grahamstown.
She'll be coming mostly with women warriors, known to be merciless
His strategies and tactics reveal his intelligence, vision, and uniqueness.
Mandasa's comfort is in my kingdom, and mine in hers.
Their arrangement can expand our minds and may calm the state of trance that neocolonialism, land dispossession, and racism has left to Africans.
So I'll stop my screen share there and just conclude with a couple of lines in that I can tell you the next version of this is being filmed today. It's piling through into my WhatsApp feed at the moment, images and recordings. And what I find most interesting and inspiring about this is the reclamation of space and language, the move in and out of a colonial archive, and the creation of independent archives that are in some way aimed to decenter the dominant narratives that have told history differently. So thanks for your time, thanks for your attention, and I shall pause there for the time being and pass straight back to Christina.
Thank you very much, Noel. Okay, I think we'll just move straight away to Vic.
Sure. Sorry, Noel, I had to just run to the bathroom. I didn't get to see the video. Please send me the link. I'd like to see that. Anyway, so I run a record label, and before I used to run a record label, I worked in two industries. I worked in journalism with some fairly large news organizations, and I worked with other medium to large size record labels. And, the idea for me to create a record label was about telling stories from parts of the world that when I covered or when I worked at particularly Western news organizations, I found the narrative to be just horrific. Someone like myself who comes from the global South, born in India, raised in Southeast Asia, from a family that has a very strong anti-colonial history to it under the British. What I saw covered in news media was quite horrific, and I wanted to use music then as a storytelling tool to tell what I believe were more real histories, more in-depth histories, more accurate histories, more wholesome perspectives on countries. So the countries we, of course, have covered are countries that I feel are consistently demonized in the press, countries like Haiti, Somalia, Sudan. So the idea to work with archives is not something that I set out to do. It's just that when you begin working with historical music, you are not just working with, a record label producer from the 1970s. Oftentimes you're coming across archives, public and private archives. So in the case of Haiti, we worked with Radio Jacmel in the South, Radio Metropole, which is the biggest Haitian radio station, wouldn't allow us to work with their archive. Radio Jacmel did. The other project we did was with the archive Christina worked with in Hargeisa and Somaliland, creating an album, curating an album from that archive, which was eventually received the Grammy nomination and told a wonderful story of Somalia and that region of Africa before the war. And then just most recently, we worked in 2019 with the Republic of Djibouti, their national radio archives. We worked with the Ministry of Culture. We worked with the Palace of the People. We worked with the national radio. It was, I mean, I wish I could tell you the experience it had negotiating and working with the Djiboutian government. It was fascinating, difficult, and all things in between. But from all of these experiences, you obviously begin developing ideas, right? Like, how do I go about working with archives? How do we do this in a way that, is beneficial for all parties, is a way that this music can come out? Because I firmly believe this music needs to be heard. Sitting in Radio Jacmel's basement archive, amid the Caribbean heat is not the best place for this music to be. I think, it's got to be heard. It's got to be out there. I think the same thing goes with the Djiboutian archive, which has such phenomenal music. And of course, the archive Christina worked with, which, the whole world took notice and said, this music is phenomenal. So there's a merit to getting this archival music out there. Of course, my label is only about 4 or 5 years old. So working with the archive in Hargeisa or in Haiti, I hadn't really fully developed ideas. It was kind of, let me go in there, let me digitize some of this equipment. In the case of Haiti, the radio actually sold us some of their vinyl records that we could use. And then, I started developing ideas of, okay, we need to not out of the country. So digitization became a big part of this process. The one thing I will say is I think, I fully respect and admire everyone who takes the most ethical approach to this, because it's very important. But if I may offer a different perspective, I think the whole concept of ethics, I think, comes from the Western experience, right? It comes from an experience of one part of the world having a great deal of power and exploiting another part of the world. So sometimes, and these are conversations I've had with, friends and colleagues in Africa and in Asia, that the Western ethical approach can sometimes seem patronizing, because it can seem as if there is one party in power that is looking down at another party and saying, we have to make this right. We have to do these things right. And sometimes, that other party can say, well, we have agency. What do you mean? We're not going to let you do it any other way. Why are you saying this has to be the way we have to do it? So to me, I never really, I'll give you another example. Whenever I tell people where I grew up in Southeast Asia, the work I do with the record label, the first thing they ask me about is the business, the nuts and bolts of the record label, logistics, distribution, these things like that. When I speak to people, particularly in Europe and North America, and of course I have lived in the United States for 10 years, when I was to speak to people there, the first question is about ethics. And I think that gives you a really good idea of where different societies are at. One is coming out of a history of colonialism, one is coming out of a history of colonization, of conducting it. And so to me, being in between these worlds, I tried to not approach anything and say, I'm going to try to do this ethically as possible. I wanted to look at it and say, how do we do this in a way that's a win-win trade? And I think the Djiboutian model that we worked with, which I really want to talk about, is what I think is everything that was, propositioned to us for this archive, for this discussion. So, for example, in Djibouti, small country in East Africa, the Red Sea, young country, independent only in 1977, they had a very, let's say, a socialist approach to music when they were independent. All of the music
Vic, can I just stop you for 1 second? I think your audio is coming in and out a tiny bit.
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Just say something again.
Can you guys hear me now?
And now it's good. So if you stay in that.
Okay, I'll just be closer to the mic. Let me turn the mic volume up a little bit. Okay, so I was at Djibouti. So Djibouti has, music was very much a public affair, right? So all of the recordings of the entire history of Djiboutian music and many of East African music that was performed or recorded in Djibouti sits in the National Radio Archives. And these archives are some of the best I have worked with. And I've been to many archives in many parts of the world. And this was so well preserved, despite the fact that Haiti, like many African countries, went through their debt crises in the 80s and 90s and where their cultural funding was gutted. They still allocated good amounts of money to keeping this archive intact, air conditioning on 24/7, training young staff constantly to attend to it. And I thought, we spent years negotiating with this government to be able to access this archive. No foreign entity, particularly a private label, were never really allowed. You could walk in and look at it, but you couldn't really do anything with it. And the proposal I made them was very clear. I said, listen, we believe this music is fantastic. You guys know this music is fantastic. We want to do what we do, which is curate and release, great albums that the whole world can hear. But what do you need in return? And they said, our equipment in the archive has now dilapidated and we don't have it. These old reel-to-reel players, all the equipment that's needed to work with these quarter-inch tapes, all the equipment that's needed to preserve these quarter-inch tapes, reel-to-reel film is quite flimsy. And they said, we need that. But you also have to pay us a ton of money to get into the archive to do your work. I said, listen, we're an independent label. We can't afford what you're asking, but I'll tell you what we will do. We'll pay you what we can afford. And we will give you, because we're going to bring a reel-to-reel player anyway to begin digitizing what, we would like to work with. And of course, they were very strict with, what we recorded, what we could take out of the archive, perfectly normal, right? That it's their archive, they preserved it, it's their volition. And I said, we will leave you that reel-to-reel player and all the assorted hardware and software that comes with it and train your younger staff in how to use it. And you can continue finishing the digitization process of your archive after we leave. And they said, that's a good proposal. We like that. And so in that way, I found that, and this is a model that I've actually said is actually when we're talking about the decolonization of archives, I can't think of, if you want to talk about decolonization, then you have to go to the era of decolonization and then see how things were set up, right? So Djibouti is a wonderful relic of that era because they came out of colonialism in 1977, and this archive and this public infrastructure around music has never really dissipated. You are still kind of working with a decolonized archive completely. They are in complete control of it. The Minister of Culture is in control of it. You have to speak to him. You got to speak to the ambassador in Washington or in Berlin. You have to speak to the national radio head. You have to speak to the Palace of the People director. You have to speak to so many government people, bureaucrats, and everyone in between to be able to access this. And then they dictate the terms. They dictate everything regarding access. We weren't allowed to go in there and just rip out whatever we want and say we want to digitize this. No, it was choose what you want. You have so many days to do so. And they know exactly what's coming out of it. We know there's an album coming out of it. We negotiate all kinds of things around the album. I mean, it was to me, almost a perfect model that I have advocated, that I think many African countries, and I say I focus on Africa when I'm talking about this because 95% of their cultural wealth sits outside the continent. So we don't want to take anything out anymore, but we still want to get that music out there. And how do we do this? I wish we could have done this with archives we worked in the past, but I didn't have the resources nor the know-how because we were just starting out. But I think this Djiboutian model to me is a fascinating model. And because we have worked with more archives coming up in the future with other national radios in Africa, with private archives as well, this is the model that we propose to everybody. And across the board, I've noticed everyone says, yeah, that's actually, that works out perfectly well, because we get the equipment we need, the know-how, the technology, and you get to release your album. And then we build a long-term relationship, which says in the future, once you digitize more of your archive, do you want to continue working with us? Can we come back and maybe produce more albums? That's completely up to them. They can say yes or no. But you build this long-term relationship. And it really reminds me of Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, who said that if you really want to be our partner, don't give us grain, don't just give us money, because then our hands are out begging for things. Give us tractors, give us the agricultural industry we need to continue the work that we need to do in the country. And I thought, that it's almost something I feel like from my upbringing. You're very much taught growing up, at least for me in Southeast Asia growing up, make sure all your business relationships are win-win trades. Make sure you are not you're not leaving anyone short. And I think this is the proposal that I put forward to working with archives going forward. And really I think this is what I would consider the model, because it not only gives many African countries have had their music really ripped out of the country. Most African recordings, vinyl records, cassette tapes, master reels, DVDs, you name it, they're all sitting somewhere else, and we see record labels going and taking a lot of stuff out. And some record labels go with the ethical approach. Oh, look, we're paying royalties, we're doing everything. I'm like, yeah, with one hand, you're paying royalties, but with other hand, you're taking out all the cultural wealth, which is invaluable. So how do we go forward to make this a sustainable way where we can continue working with historic African music or historic music from Southeast Asia or the Caribbean, in which you are not removing the cultural wealth, but the music can still be heard by the world. And all the technology in the world is available for you to digitize this in the highest quality possible without removing anything. And the quality will not suffer one bit for any record label people or music lovers out, audiophiles out there. Your quality is not really going to suffer with the technology we have today. So I think it's a wonderful model, because if you take another country like, say, Senegal, for example, which still has quite a bit of cultural funding, I propose that what if Senegal was to take a lot of its cultural heritage, its master recordings, it's from old record labels where the record label owner is no longer around and it's sitting in someone's home archive, wherever. What if you were to put them in an archive like a Djiboutian archive? It doesn't have to be a public archive. It doesn't have to be a national radio. It can be a private archive. But then what happens then? You then shift the entire power dynamics of who is allowing access to that archive. Who's setting the terms? Who's allowing, which label is allowed to work with it? Which entity, which institution is allowed to work with it? And in that way, I think what you have, which I think is not just in the music industry, but across the board today in Africa, you have multiple partners that African countries in particular can work with to get the best deals for themselves. So, we were fortunate that, the Djiboutian archive was actually not quite known. So when we went to the country to do some work, the national radio invited us to look at the archive, but say many record labels knew about it. The Djibouti then has the power to say, well, all of you put your proposals in front of us and we'll pick the best one, play us off each other until you get the best deal for yourself. And I think this is, to me is the quintessential decolonized archive. It's an archive you see a format you see a lot of in Southeast Asia, which has really developed immensely over the last few decades. And I've tried to work with archives in East Asia, and they are so strict. I have had very little success even with my proposals, trying to access them in Malaysia and Indonesia. But I think the Djiboutian model that we worked with was so win-win, and all parties came out of it quite happy. I mean, despite the amount of negotiations we had to do, it was incredible. And we will be releasing a few albums from there, from some of the key bands from that country. And the country is loving seeing the press that comes with it. The government was so infatuated with what we were able to produce that the president of Djibouti actually asked me to write him a letter explaining exactly what we did in the archive. So I went ahead and did that because he said, "Oh wow, he's a lover of music," and he said, "Well, Djiboutian music is getting out there in the world. How did this happen?" So this is the relationship that I want to build with many countries, many archives, as a private label producer, because I firmly believe this music should get out there. And any concerns of who gets to hear this kind of go out the window, because when it's out there, it's on YouTube, it's on every streaming service. Anyone in the world today with a smartphone can listen to the music we have digitized and put out there. And I can tell you, particularly on YouTube, the amount of, when we see the data, the amount of people in the countries themselves or in the regions that are listening to it, if you even just look at the comments on some of the songs on YouTube, they're all from the country or the region in question, right? So it's not just people in rich countries getting to hear this. Sure, maybe the physical product, yes, but in the end of the day, that music really, really, really gets out there. And it's done to me. And what I wouldn't say so much, again, I want to get away from the concept of ethics as it's understood in the Western paradigm and get to a sustainable way to do this, where we're not ransacking or looting Africa's cultural heritage or the Caribbean's or Southeast Asia's anymore. So as long as the gatekeepers, the term setters are on the continent, in the country, in charge of the archive, determining who can get in, playing each other off, getting the best deal for themselves, I think this is the model for the future. And I would encourage all record labels to stop taking physical artifacts out of the country, whether it's posters, anything that relates to the music, and working directly with archives in the country in a way that you are providing them with the technology that they need, if they need it, and you are getting in return albums that you can produce that can go on to get global acclaim or award nominations. And this is what I would consider to be a future model, and I hope record labels would adhere to it and find it beneficial.
All right, thank you very much, Vic. I think maybe if Aaron and Noel, if you want to unmute yourselves now. Before we open it up to everybody, I just want to give the three of you a chance, if you have questions for each other, to ask those questions. I have a very selfish question of my own, if none of you have one immediately. Yeah, okay, so my part, this comes, well, I already mentioned Vic and I met in this archive, which was not an archive collected by some foreign researcher. It was a locally kind of produced archive made of, and the music was recorded by the socialist government, put on various cassettes, and then kind of regathered in this space. So that was my first kind of exposure. And then I went to read about sound archives, and the whole discussion kind of in anthropology and ethnomusicology is this discussion about who owns this, how do we, what does repatriation mean, what are the kind of ethical implications here. So there are two very different kinds of archives, and I think we've heard from both perspectives there. And Noel, you started to mention that you think that there are links between kind of what people producing music do. So I'm just generally interested in what you think kind of the conversations that are happening in the music industry might say to the conversations that are kind of happening in the walls of academia. Do they have anything to say to each other?
Maybe I'll just pick up really briefly and take this right back to, I think, your opening phrase, Christina, about the complicated space that is the archive. And then I think Aaron mentioned the limits of the archive, and then Vic, interested in future models. I find it really interesting the possibilities and problems that happen, say, between, say, music industry and academic ethnography, how they do and don't talk to each other. One moves fast, one moves slow, and also things like when a personal archive becomes an institutional archive, and then that institutional archive creates possibility and anger, and how that's dealt with. And, I suppose what's central here is the perception of not just cultural value, but money as well. The perception that an institutional archive like ILAM or something like that is dripping with money when it's not, and that the Black Power Station is dripping with money when 15 Americans turn up to work in it last summer, but it's not, so perceptions of value and how you manage that. And I'm really interested in where kind of these professional worlds can meet each other. You know, the professional music industry, the professional research, and you know, every artist I know is a serious researcher. You know, so yeah, just a couple of threads there that maybe Vic or Aaron might be interested in picking up or rejecting. You know.
Well, my projects intersect the music industry in different ways, and the communities that I've worked in, certainly substantial ways. Where it tends to show up as a directly intersecting factor is around the use of archivally sourced materials, originally is the wrong word, archivally sourced materials by young artists, generally working in some kind of hip hop inflected domains, which, you know, as a generational aesthetic privilege sampling, and a deconstructive approach to primary audio texts. Some people on this call know this story. Some people on this call were present when this happened, but I always love to tell a really quick story that I think is illustrative of. Actually, the thought that occurred to me, it was actually the orienting thought I had for the day today, and it was really amplified by hearing both Vic and Noel talk, is about, and it goes back to the Dylan Robinson reference I made before, is about temporalities and the sort of ways in which we synchronize our temporalities, which includes things like wealth and power transfers and the like, but also includes really basic assumptions about our subjective orientation to the work we do and the people we know and the interactions we have with them. Anyway, the story I was going to tell, which is much funnier than talking about temporalities, is of an Inupiaq hip hop artist I'm close to. I call her cousin, named, she performs as Aku Matu, A-K-U-M-A-T-U. She's a theater performer, performance artist. She's a wide-ranging artist, so calling her hip hop artist, as with many of the native performers I know, is a music industry label of convenience that works under some conditions. We had her to perform at Columbia back in 2010 or 11. She's been there a bunch of times, but she came for a performance at Columbia. And this was for a conference where we had indigenous elders from both North and South America in attendance at the conference, about a dozen of them from different communities. And it was an amazing event called Native Sounds North and South. And a number of the guests were Alaska Native elders I had worked with in repatriation contexts. And then they came for the performance by Aku Matu, whose real name is Allison Warden, who is Inupiaq. She's from Kaktovik, Alaska, but lives in Anchorage and does very hip hop inflected sort of theatrical performance art. And Allison came up on the stage for the performance dressed as an elder, with a scarf around her head and hunched over. She does a brilliant elder imitation, and a lot of her rap songs actually include an elder voice rapping. But she condemned her own performance in advance for taking liberties with the Inupiaq tradition in front of the Inupiaq elders, right? So she showed respect by saying, what I'm about to do is going to rub some of you the wrong way, and I'm going to own that through this sort of self-deprecating condemnation of my own upcoming performance for not being sufficiently respectful of the wholeness of these songs and voices that I'm sampling from here. I think about that a lot. The other story I'll tell, I mentioned George Nungawuk, the elder of Savunga I'm working with now. I called George from Anchorage on my first trip to Savunga, and I said, hey, George, you know, there's nothing in Savunga. There's one store, and it has about 9 things. I said, you want anything from Anchorage on my way out? And among the things he said I should pick up was a couple sets of guitar strings, because he had a guitar around that didn't have any strings anymore, and he wanted to play guitar again. The week I spent in Savunga, George and I worked all day long on archival recordings and digitizing and cataloging and going through old hard drives and tapes. And then every night after dinner, we sat around and played country and Western songs on our guitars. I tell those stories to try to think about, you know, synchrony and asynchrony, like on Zoom, like in our zoomed out world where we now talk about asynchronous teaching. That's an extensible concept for me. Like, and to me, I'll say one more thing. I know I'm carrying on. the greatest ethical failing of the field recordists whose archives I've had occasion to work with, which the structural weight of their times maybe made it impossible for them to see, was their failure to consider the people they were recording as contemporaneous fellow citizens, right? As people who vote in the same election I do and serve in the military of my country, and are not there to exemplify something from the past, but live in the same present as my institution or my grant or my and so actually the practical suggestion I have for colleagues out there, we made George Nungawuk the PI on our National Science Foundation grant. Do that.
Well, I would just say in terms of the collision or the relationship between academia and private industry, it's funny. I mean, in the music space industry, we talk about this a lot, right? Because a lot of the critiques we get are from academia. And is my mic working? Is everything cool?
It's going in and out.
It's still going in and out? Oh, geez.
I think it might be the cable, not how close you are to it.
Okay. How about I just use my other mic? 1 second. Sorry, guys. Okay, can you guys hear me now? Is that better? Okay. So, sorry, I wanted to use the professional mic. So a lot of the critiques we get are from academia, right? Like the issues surrounding archives that we just released, or we just announced an album and someone wrote about in a French online publication that we're raiding archives in East Africa, so that we get a lot of this from, I believe it was an academic who wrote that. So, I mean, we get a lot of this from the academic space. So I would like to see less of the collision and more of, can we sit down and talk about this like we're doing now? Because I think there's a lot of things not only to clarify with each other, but also models. I keep getting back to this, models to develop with each other. I don't think it's very helpful to sit in the music space and the academic space and then say, music space says, we're going to do it this way. And the academic space says, no, we have a very good concept of the history of this and we don't agree with how you're doing it. That's fine. I think that the main thing is coming together and devising these models, because then if we did, I wouldn't have had to work with 3-4 archives before I came up with the best way to work with to work with archives. We would have had a model in place. I still don't think we have a model in place. And I think that's where academia could really come in and say, we have a very broad understanding of this. All the intricacies, we've written about this extensively. There's even a book someone wrote about, if anyone's heard of the Sublime Frequencies label, someone wrote academics got together and wrote an entire book critiquing the Sublime Frequencies label. But that book didn't offer any future models or sustainability ideas or anything of the sort. So I think that's where we can really come together and have even a conference to say, let's sit down and devise the best model possible. And let's maybe even try to get away from a lot of the things that hold us back. I mean, we all don't want any kind of colonial era, initiatives or values to come back into play. We all don't want exploitation to happen, even though in a private setting in the private music industry, you're doing everything to minimize it, but just the way it's structured, I won't get into it, but the devising of models, I think, is the way to go forward, and to bring the bigger record labels on board and say, listen, guys, you guys have been taking records out of Africa, plastering it on your Instagram and everything. Look how many thousands of records I took out of Nigeria or the Congo or wherever. Like, that's not cool anymore. Let's figure out a way to not fetishize this and turn it into almost like another sort of pornography, this kind of, look at all this cultural wealth I'm taking out of the country. And I'm going to produce these amazing albums out of them. It's like I said, it's with one hand, you're going with the royalty payments and all the music industry stuff. And with one hand, you're taking all this culture out of the country, the valuable and the invaluable. So, I think the prime thing for academia and the music industry to come together is to have a solid discussion about models. When working with historic music, in particular, which is a growing space, a growing industry, a lot of labels in the scene, and a lot of bigger labels now looking at what independent labels are doing, the spaces and the countries they're working in, and saying, oh, wow, there's actually music to be made here, music to be found here, music that is, you know, excellent. And then, you know, swooping in as well, and then bringing those bigger labels on board. I mean, Sony Music and everyone only opened their African head offices in West Africa only, I think, you know, a few years ago. And I think that had a great deal to do with the kind of music that independent labels, including, say, Nigerian labels, but also foreign labels working with Africa had come to showcase to the world, and really open people's eyes to say, wow, there's a lot of opportunity here for the music business. And there's a lot of opportunity for academia to step in and say, let's sit down and devise models that work. If you're going to work with archives and historical music on the continent of Africa in particular, because 95% of its wealth sits outside, or in the Caribbean, in Haiti, for example, or in Indonesia, for example, how do we do this? And I think that is the number one priority. Right now, I find that it's almost like two teams, and we're constantly just clashing all the time, and it goes nowhere.
Thanks. I don't think we're not going to resolve the issue now, but I think it's great to talk about. And also, I think it's good for those of us in academia to maybe push ourselves a little bit and think about the beyond the kind of abstract conversations that we tend to have. I would just, one comment, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. Just the one thing that strikes me from this was Aaron made a comment about kind of the limits of thinking about the archive as agentive, and I wonder if that might be kind of a thread that's running through both of these. I've had a few requests from people who want to comment and or ask questions. The first is going to be Anthony Seeger, and then if there are other people who would like to ask a question, you can either use the little raise hand function or just type in the chat either privately to me or generally, and we can also read it out if you don't want to turn your mic on. All right, so Anthony, if you want to turn your mic on.
I'm on.
You are there, okay.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to congratulate you on the initiative and also the three speakers who I think raised really interesting questions and have a wonderful breadth of experience. I also ran a record company and also ran an archive, and also am a researcher. And I think one of the things missing in Vic's comments on working with archives is that archives are more custodians of material that is created by other people. And so what you're missing when you're dealing only with an archive is the artists themselves, who may in fact be struggling to find people to learn their traditions and have their own challenges. So as we think of models, I think it's worth considering that community artists might themselves be part of the equation. I did one project with Elam and also in India, in which the idea was that the archive would get 50% of any download income, and half of that would then go to the artists in the communities. And that worked very well in India because they set up contracts. And so in a sense, my feeling about archives is they aren't really acting in the interests of the communities and the traditions that they hold. They're holding them for people to use. And I think we found in the United States that many groups don't want the music out there. And the archive may say, sure, it's fine. And that was true with Laura Bolton, but it wasn't true of the people that Laura had recorded necessarily. And so there is an equation in addition to archives. I think we also have to think about what it is that archives holds and in what way they have any authority over it. That's it. Thanks. Wonderful session. And thank you for organizing.
Do you want to respond, Vic?
Yeah, so no, it's a very good point. I didn't even get into that. I didn't have enough time to talk about then going about the whole licensing of finding the artists afterwards. This is what you have to do. The archive is the holder of music. You do a deal with them to get the music, and then yeah, you have to go find. We go and find all the artists. But again, in the case of Djibouti, very interesting because they founded the bands, they produced the bands, they paid the bands. They are effectively the master rights holders, the published rights holders. The national radio is, right? And the artists are literally just a stone's throw away from the national radio. So the entire deal we did with the national radio encompassed working with the artists, all those who are still alive, for example. So again, a very interesting approach, because that was the approach of the era of decolonization. Everything falls under the public wing, public funding. The bands all belong to different entities in the government, and therefore, when you're talking about rights in Djibouti, in that country in particular, everything belonged to that one entity, the National Radio or the Palace of the People, or depending on whichever group or whichever cultural or political institution that band or artist, mainly band, belonged to. And then, you know, you do the deal directly with them. So I completely understand that. That's something you definitely have to do. And that then is, I think, a different conversation about licensing music, which is its own murky gray area, which has taken on, you know, many debates and can differ from country to country depending on their cultural hierarchy of ownership. But yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that's a conversation I would have loved to include it in this talk. I was just focusing on the archives, but you most certainly, yes, you have to find the artists, interview them so you know their story, tell that story, secure the rights from them, you know, whatever you have to do. So that's very much part and parcel of it. But without the physical music, the first stop, very little of that can happen. And you often, you learn, the archive, even working with it, is a learning experience, right? You learn about the artists, you learn about their connections, you learn that, you know, these artists are maybe not even from the country. They were from Sudan and they recorded in Djibouti. They were from Guadeloupe and they recorded in Haiti. You know, so it becomes then a global endeavor to find them. So it's definitely the second phase after working with the archive, and that is I think a question for a question about licensing models, which is another can of worms.
Yeah, just to add to this, one of the things that came out of running into Vic in the archives in Somaliland is that in my research, I was working with a lot of the musicians who were recorded there, and ended up trying to track them down and talk to them about what it would mean to kind of release this music and what kind of compensation might be involved. So rest assured, these are conversations that are happening. We're going to open up to general questions. I just want to mention the recording is still going, just so that we have a record, but we will edit out. We won't post anything from kind of audience members when the video is published. All right, so does anybody else have questions or comments?
If not, could I actually just follow it slightly on? I think there are some emergent thematic issues here having to do with, you know, the particular histories of colonization and decolonization, in which archives are nodal points. And so for those of us who work with Indigenous, First Nations, Native American, and Alaska Native communities and the like in the Americas, deal with a really different contemporary politics of decolonization, possibly than people who work in Djibouti or India, related and, you know, obviously connected in all kinds of ways, including by a kind of increasing use of the concept of indigeneity itself as a way to distinguish various kinds of claims on heritage and history. You know, I would, you know, it's almost, I actually, when I teach a course on music and cultural property, I do it around two primary case studies, the first of which is the download wars, you know, Napster and MP3s and the birth of online digital downloading pop music. And the students' immediate subjective positionality is this should be free, right? They shouldn't prosecute people for downloading songs if they, you know, like taking the position that the market is a leveling force, and, you know, innovation happens when people push at the edges of the law and this and that. And then I teach the case of Native American repatriation, and students come to a very quick intuitive understanding that these folks should have control of their recordings. And many of them who do not want these recordings published or circulated or in archives on behalf of their own family, their own community, their own tribe, and often out of a sense that you guys have mismanaged them for 50 or 60 years. Why should we trust you to keep managing them? I haven't mentioned Robin Gray, who's another collaborator of mine. It's a Tsimshian anthropologist in Canada whose work is absolutely critical on this. I highly recommend her dissertation's available, her book's coming. But it really changed my thinking on this. So just to say, I think there are some, sort of ways in which the question about the industry versus community rights and individual performers' rights that Professor Seeger raises would diverge depending on where in the world and what history and what music and what lineage of commodification one is dealing with.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, YouTube for me, for some projects, is the #1 starting point when I don't know anything about a country's musical history and I hear one track and I think this is fascinating. Not only because the music's good, but it reveals to me a very brand new history of the world, because that music has 15 cultures in it, which means that part of the world must have been a crossroads that we don't really learn about. So YouTube to me is an immense resource. It can be a little bit tricky because you're navigating in many different languages. And so you have to, either work with someone from the country who knows the language or use Google Translate to its best ability. But we've learned, not only have I learned a great deal from researching on YouTube. So for example, before we worked with the archive in Hargeisa that Christina's, a part of, everything we learned about Somali music, we learned from YouTube. And so when we got to that archive in Hargeisa, we weren't blind. We knew artists, we knew bands, we knew style, we knew a lot. So we had a roadmap so that, it's very daunting sitting with an archive and saying we only have an indie label budget to hang around for 2 weeks or 3 weeks and say, how much can we work with here? I think you need to have YouTube as a roadmap, as a music producer, to learn about that country. Even if we want to record a new band from the country, which we are doing and we want to do more, before you can do that, you have to learn about the history of that country's music entirely, all the sounds, styles, bands, everything, before you can have a intelligent approach to producing a brand new band and making sure that the sound is, something that is respectful of the heritage, at the same time, something that is contemporary. I mean, you need to have that grounding. And I think YouTube has been a huge for that. It's also been huge because when all our albums are uploaded, you can stream it on YouTube. A lot of the times people correct and say, you got the translation of this song wrong. Sorry, our bad. You got, this artist was actually just the writer of the song. It wasn't the actual art. So we get corrected a lot. We actually get leads to new stuff. Someone will say, I'm the daughter of this artist, please get in touch with me. I would love to give you more of my mother's work to see what, all kinds of things happen from this mass dissemination of music that happens when you're able to put these into these streaming distribution cycles, like YouTube in particular, because Spotify is not available everywhere, but everyone can access YouTube, and we take off all the geographic restrictions of the music, right? So we make sure it's available literally worldwide. So YouTube is an immense resource if you use it correctly to learn about music and to correct yourself in retrospect. And so, a lot of our projects have started and been a success, thankfully, to the uploaders and knowledge providers and just commenters and children of the artists who are like, hey, that's my dad. So it's an immense resource.
Yeah, thanks, Vic. Just to add a little aside, I think the founder of the archive, actually, where Vic and I met, he did all this work together, all of these cassettes, but then one day he just said to me kind of, oh, YouTube already saved all of this. So in a sense, Somali music fans have already done the work of preserving this music by uploading it onto YouTube. And yeah, it has, in my own research, also been a really kind of fascinating source. We have 2 questions. I think we'll first take one from Joella and then one from Audrey.
I guess what you're talking about is contemporary music, right? Contemporary music being recorded by local producers. So in many times, the artists or the band themselves in many countries, particularly countries we work with, are the producers of their own music. They self-release their music, or they pay for the studio time and they go and then they upload it on YouTube or however they want to disseminate it. They put it on a memory card and on people's phones. So for example, the newer recordings that we're doing with bands in Africa, or we're trying to do, at least when the pandemic ends, with bands in Africa and elsewhere, we are not so much producing the record because, we don't have we know what's good music, and we know technically how to record it, every different style. That's what we're bringing to the table. But what they are bringing is essentially, it's their production, right? They're telling us which songs are important, which songs they might want to cover, what is their original composition. So I find the role of the producer and the artist, at least the countries we've worked in, are usually one in the same. Local producers right now in Africa are doing something exceptional as well, especially in Uganda. They are producing really the younger music, which is not really our space. They're producing a lot of the younger music, the younger crowds that are listening to in clubs, the electronic music that's coming out of the continent today. That is really, I think, a very different space, and they have full, that's their space. It's an incredible space that we don't even really interact with, because it's not something, it's not our repertoire. It's not the philosophy, the kind of sound our label wants to put out, even though it's fantastic music. So I would just say that the production of all this work, we are bringing the technical expertise to record this in the way we think is going to produce an amazing record. And we are bringing some of our knowledge of that country's historical music to say, how do we structure this album? What kind of song should be on it? What should be the general sound of the album? Should there be an emphasis on instrumentation? Should there be an emphasis on vocal performance, or maybe both? So when we produce an album that way. But the production itself, like in Djibouti, again, we recorded the national radio band. They're called Group RTD. Phenomenal band. They produced that record. We just recorded it, if you know what I mean. Like they knew which song, because we had a few songs that we loved. We said, can you produce, let's listen to how you play them. But the rest of the album, we said, you know what, you guys, it's like sending a team out, like a sports team out, and saying, you guys come up with the tactics. You guys produce your own record. We are just bringing the recording equipment to do this in the highest quality. So oftentimes I feel that production role kind of gets blurred. And the artists themselves, because you are working with a culture that you don't know everything about their music, they are bringing a great deal of production aspect to it. And they are hugely responsible not only for playing the music, but conceiving the ideas behind the production and the selection of the songs, and pulling rabbits out of hats in the studio, and doing all kinds of amazing things that normally producers would do. So that would be my answer to your question. I think the roles kind of get, the roles change. It's not the same setting as recording an album, by a big label, say in the UK or the United States. It's very different roles and that come into play.
Noel or Aaron, do you want to add anything? I know, Noel, you work with some local artists also.
Yeah, thanks, Jola. Thanks, Vicky. I just had to really briefly say, in my experience, yeah, so we there are, as Vic says, the critiques of say the music industry's relationship to anthropology, ethnography, etc. But most local artists I know are very keen for the international connectivity that things like the Beating Heart Project could bring, or Vic's work, etc. And that they make an artist-to-artist decision about the platforms they want to engage with. And I saw the Beating Heart Project has very quickly raised a whole series of IMAX for the Access Music Project in Makanda, much quicker than an academic grant would have got them there, or something, and also I saw in the question about, how do we resist the globalization, or be sure that people are, owning the things they own. In the Black Power Station example, nothing goes out under that banner without the decisions of the collectively owned crew, so they stamp it when they're ready to put it out, and they resist it. And the final thing I'd add in is that if the artists quite often are very keen to have this kind of international connectivity, the Black Power Station is a world-class space. The world just doesn't really know it yet, These artists and collective initiatives, they're very interested in the academic spaces as well, like having access to what we have here, and we've been opening up UVA as much as we can for residencies. So it's not just, opening up our spaces to share with artists. That goes right to the top of the music industry. So it's a bit convoluted reply, but I see so much potential in this, as well as the dangers,
All right.
That last point is great. It's so important. The idea that there aren't really two spaces and two worlds, like those kinds of images and metaphors, I find really disruptive of my own relational work. Yeah, we're in two different physical places and they have different histories. But I mean, to the extent that, you know, the archive really is a neutral site in any sense, it has to be uh, uh, not a physical space that somebody controls um, exclusively, or if it does, the rationale for that control has to um, uh, uh, be articulated um, in ethical terms, which it can be. I think there's one thing that comes up is every time we're sort of tossing around terms like the music industry and the market and so forth, right? A notion that a primary good of music is to be heard and sold and circulated, which is not always the way people feel about their sounds. So I think it's really, I'm going to put it in bumper sticker form, but one needs to be careful not to conflate decolonization with capitalism.
I'm not, I mean, I've only spoken to government officials in a couple of countries actually, because they're always fascinated. You know, I think some countries where no one really goes for the music. So, you know, I've sat with, you know, people in the Ministry of Culture in Somalia and Mogadishu and had a long conversation with them. I wouldn't say they're so concerned. In Somalia, for example, they definitely, I mean, it's a great question you bring up, because when I sat with the Ministry of Culture people, first they talked about the archive and Radio Mogadishu and what we could do and all that. But then they told me two things that were really interesting. One, they said they want to build a copyright infrastructure, given that the country has just emerged from 3 decades of civil war. And they want that copyright infrastructure to be something that is molded to, again, Somali cultural hierarchies, as well, that can conform or at least plug and play with international copyright standards. So you have this kind of protection. So they literally asked me, can you help us devise this? I said, you know, you're going to need a copyright lawyer for that. I can only, you know, I work with music. But the other thing that they're more concerned about, and I think this is really important, someone in Somalia, one of the Ministry of Culture guys told me, he said, you know, if we have a broken road, we can fix it. If we need healthcare, we know we have to build a hospital. We don't know, though, how do we change our global image? Because every news story about us is negative. And to me, that to them is same thing in Djibouti. I mean, they are first concerned with this music's coming out, fantastic. Djibouti's name is going to have a different feel to it now because people know that there's some good music attached to it. So images to them, global public images, public relations are actually incredibly important. The second thing I want to say is that there's a lot of countries that have copyright laws, so that when we go and license music, for example, say in Sudan, which has a robust copyright infrastructure on its own. Part of it is derived from British common law, as it was a British colony. And a lot of it, upon independence, was molded to fit Sudanese cultural, the entire cultural world of Sudan. So they have a copyright law for, you know, very traditional music. They have a copyright law for orchestral music. And we sat with the Sudanese lawyer of Sudan's greatest artist, Muhammad Wardi, and the family lawyer, and he literally gave us a master class in Sudanese copyright law. He said, if you want to go and license this album, this is how you have to do it under Sudanese copyright law. And my lawyer said, you know, you should do it more towards internet. You know, he's giving me the legal advice, like you got to do it more under international copyright law. That's how you stay protected, blah, blah, blah. But like I said, you know what, let's do it under the Sudanese way, because this is what they've set up. So a lot of countries have these laws in place and they have their own infrastructure, not all, but a lot of them do, which conform greatly to how they perceive ownership, how they perceive hierarchies, how they perceive all these things, and they've molded different Western laws, international laws to work for them. And some countries are trying to build their copyright infrastructure. So in that case, you know, I wish I had more to give the policymakers or the lawmakers in Somalia that I spoke to, who said we want to draft an entire new copyright regime to protect, you know, retrospectively all the music that we have in this country that has been preserved in these various archives. How do we go about doing it? I didn't have the answer for them, but I hope that answers your question.
This is something, of course, I've written about and thought about a lot, but in response to the previous question, anthropologists and ethnomusicologists are deeply involved in international organizations that deal with rights, including UNESCO and the World Intellectual Property Organization and others. So yes, there is representation and attempt to represent non-capitalist knowledge traditional and get it thought about under these issues. Now, as for the way the archives work, I know that the National Library, the British Library had a project in which they wanted to post most of the traditional music revival artists on the website and get permission to do it. And so they did that basically by asking a number of them, and then by posting everybody and getting everybody was happy to have their music available to more people and have a larger audience for what they recorded. And so they put it up with a statement saying, if anybody who was performing objects to this being here, we can take it down, but you have to contact us and explain why. And I think they'd only had one person who contacted them, and that person ended up happy to have it up. So to a certain extent, you take a risk management approach if you're an archive. You know, some things really can't go up without asking people, because you, in my case, it was if it was religious music or if it was indigenous music, if it was somehow indigenous music, then there was no question it couldn't go up. But other kinds of music, you could argue, it could go up, and you can take a chance and see what happens. And I think that's what they're doing in those archives. The CRIM was a very complicated project to get underway, partly because of this, and I think they decided just to put it up and make it available. That's it.
I'll turn my mic on. My snowplow guy is out front, so it might get a little noisy here. We'll see. So there's a million things to say about that. One thing is, it seems to be my riff today is to recommend someone's work in addition to Tony Seeger's, which is the fountain of all of this stuff, really. Trevor Reed, if you guys have not encountered the work of Trevor Reed, is a professor of law at the University of Arizona. He was a Columbia ethnomusicology PhD and JD a few years ago. He's a Hopi scholar of cultural property rights and indigenous rights in sound archives in particular, and has a series of really important papers out that get into the nitty-gritty of rights frameworks from an indigenous perspective. It's a particularly fraught issue for Hopi, both the community and the musical tradition, one of the more depredated indigenous cultures in North America, and commodified and other things. So Trevor Reed, I'll post some links in the chat to some of his stuff. A lot of it's law journal stuff. The other thing, just broadly speaking, if to send you back into some of my own stuff, that I spend a fair bit of time trying to think about what the original individual performers on the recordings I work with were thinking. To me, that's really the central question of ethnographic repatriation work. Perhaps to put it more correctly, how the contemporary community thinks they were thinking. Or what insight they have into the encounters that produce the recordings. This is really over determined for me by working with the Inupiaq folks in Alaska, who have a very strong cultural ethic of reciprocity and sharing as principal modes of engagement with the outside world. So, in several articles I've made the point that contrary to the view of the recording of Inupiaq songs by Laura Bolton as a sort of one-way disempowered encounter, that the Inupiaq musicians who shared songs with her had every intention of exactly creating international relationships, of reaching out to the world and sending something out into the world with the expectation that something would then return to them, because that's their economic model. That is their central understanding of, based on the scarcity of the Arctic economy. When you're hungry, someone feeds you. When someone's hungry, you feed them. It's really simple. And it involves an ethic of the first thing you do is exchange goods, hoping they move out into the world and make connections for you for the future. So reconstructing that intentionality from the in this case, it's 45 recordings, 46, excuse me, 1946 recordings of Inupiaq music by Bolton, really changes the view of these, sort of poor, disempowered people getting raided by this, outsider with a tape recorder. Among other things, Inupiaq were already into cameras and tape recorders when she showed up. And as an Inupiaq whaling captain once said to me, our tradition has always been to use the best tool.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I mean, ideally, so for example, in the case of the archive in Hargeisa with Christina, a lot of that music was recorded live on stage onto a mono little deck that all the instruments are going into one channel. And if you really wanted to hear it, unfortunately, for all the tragedy that Somalia has faced, if everything comes back, you can go to Mogadishu and hear it again in those grand ballrooms. That's how it's meant to be heard. The next best thing is when you're taking it from the archive and it's in that 1980s woozy tape atmosphere, recorded in this very, just completely quick, let's do it way, on whatever equipment we can. When we remaster it, it's only if you ever hear the remaster, I mean, I wish I could do something where I could show you the original sound file and then show you and then the remastered version. We try to take nothing out of it. It's like it's remastered in a way that you are still hearing what it would have sounded like if you pulled that tape out from stage and put it in your stereo in 1982. And we're trying to get it as best as possible to that while still balancing it out to say, we have all these modern ways of listening to music. But, also the issue is that once you disseminate it digitally, every single one of these iTunes, Spotify, whatever, they all compress and mess it up in their own way. So I mean, I don't even listen to stuff on streaming services because they completely take everything out of it. But I mean, to hear the music as it was intended, particularly in the eras we work with, it would have to be live stages in Port-au-Prince, in Pétionville, in the suburb of Port-au-Prince, where the rich would go to these grand ballrooms and listen to, Le Gypsy de Pétionville play, amazing Haitian music. It would have to be at the Aruba Hotel in Mogadishu where Somali bands would play. So that would be the original intention of this music to listen to it. And unfortunately, in lieu of that, it's actually some of these countries you can still go and get a very good taste of that. You can go to Dakar today and still listen to a lot of the Afro-Cuban music that was made in 1970 Senegal. And everyone's dressed up really nicely as they did back then. Everyone's slow dancing. It's an Afro-Cuban band on stage. So that is the most authentic way to quote unquote consume this music. For the global audience, the best we can do is make sure that when we remaster it, it's never taking how it was intended to be recorded. We always find out how the music was recorded, right, before we remaster it. How did you record the sound? Why does it sound like this? Oh, we hung mics from the wall, and that's how we recorded it. Or we had a tape deck that we put all the instruments into. Or we sat in a studio and recorded this absolutely professionally, in which case you can, consume it as is. But we just try to take out, we try not to take out, we want you to, we want that sound to transport you. We want the aesthetic of the sound, the texture to transport you back exactly to what it was. That's the best we can really do, short of going to the country and listening to it live, because all of this music, at least the ones we produce, are all meant to be heard in the citadels of music in their respective capitals or towns or cities. So that unfortunately we all can't do that, but that is the best way to this date. Live, nothing ever going to top live music, and I hope it comes back post vaccines or whatever.
Noel or Aaron, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I mean, I think there is. It's possible to get very wrapped up in a technological discussion. I think in the community of archivists and people who work in these spaces, and likewise people in the world music space, where there is commodity value placed on the mark of the archive being on a recording. the scratchy record, right? The signs of its distance from the presence and so forth. So I can often find myself quite sympathetic to what Vic is saying about the sort of the importance of quality, right? As a mark of respect, right? Like that, and the kind of the standard. Although aesthetically, right, you could do two different things with a digital audio workstation and a bunch of plugins. One, clean it up so that it sounds almost like it was made in a modern studio, right, with great compression, and you've added in your simulated delay, and you've gotten rid of all the noise using your noise eraser software. Or you can really enhance the kind of physical materiality of the archival recording, right, and bring out just the right aesthetic mix of scratchiness and audibility. And so not to think of that as as a binary, but a spectrum of possibilities that technology enables, but always to remember that the sort of first principle for me of sound archiving, which is the material object is not the thing. The thing is the idea, right? That's passing through history and time and hands and places and minds in various material forms, which really become most important and interesting when they're activated as motion, as waves in the air, as sound, right? That people listen to, and in that moment, right, all the agency of listening, all the subjectivity of listening, all the historicity of listening comes to bear on the moment of consumption, which I think that's why I plugged Dylan Robinson's work before. That it's really had me thinking about the moment of listening rather than the material object as what it is archives actually curate or try to curate and get involved in the curation of collaboratively.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add something, Noel, or should we go to the next question?
Yeah, very briefly. Thanks for the question. The authentic consumption, I think, was at the heart there. So my own experience with the artists I know and work with in South Africa, nearly all of them are fluid between traditional ceremonial music and contemporary hip hop, kwaito, amapiano. Most of them do both. And so for them, the artists I work with, there's multiple layers of access in it. Some is through the National Arts Festival, some is free online, and there's also limits. There are some things that will not be commodified. There are certain things that people will not commodify for reasons, with ethical reasons within communities and things like that. So it's becoming awareness of the different layers of access and how people want they want their music monetized in lots of ways. They want products and income, and there's some things that won't be commoditized. So I think there's a range of ways to relate to that.
Thanks for your question. So first, the diaspora, we can't do anything with the diaspora. We rely entirely on the diaspora before we even enter the country. They're the ones who hook us up with everything. And we build the most lasting relationships with the diaspora. If I ever get married, they're all gonna come to my wedding. I'll tell you that much. They've helped us more than anybody, So it's the most important. They are the door, the gateway for us to access countries that are perhaps difficult, or at least perceived to be difficult. It's difficult to show up in Mogadishu. It's difficult to just show up in Khartoum's a little bit easier, but without people in the diaspora who literally are they are the guardians of this project. They see us through. They open up conversations. When we were on the ground, the people who are greeting us are because someone in the diaspora has set it up. We enter Muhammad Wardi's house because someone in the diaspora has put us in touch and vetted us and said, these guys are good. You can work with them. So for sure, the diaspora is incredibly important, and people should also realize that the Somali diaspora in particular is now 1 million strong, which is the largest African diaspora in the world. People don't really mention that. And so obviously they play a huge role, and almost all the musicians live in the diaspora. So when we're licensing these albums, we are in Minnesota, we're in Malaysia, we're in Kenya, we're all over the world trying to get people on the phone or on Skype or whatever, on email. So the diasporas play a huge role. The second part of your question about access, we would love to do something like an exhibition in Khartoum. We've been talking to people about doing that. But I will say that access is, like, again, very easy. I remember a friend of mine from college, my Nigerian friend from college, he visited Khartoum like a couple of Christmases ago. And he said, Vic, I heard your Sudanese compilation was playing everywhere. I said, where did you hear it? He was like, it was on the radio, because we sent it to the radio. He's like, it was, people were streaming it on YouTube, this, that. So it was really amazing to hear that people in the country were jamming to, our Sudanese compilation. So I think, again, access, thankfully, because of the digital world, it doesn't get limited to just Western markets or rich country markets. It is still, very well disseminated. And if I look at the data, again, looking at the YouTube streams or whatever, I always see the countries that are streaming, and you can rest assured the country the music's coming from is always at the top. So.
Okay.
I had two thoughts hearing these questions together. And one is that we haven't really framed or discussed a fairly important issue here, which is the nation state and its relationship to its, colonial history, its indigenous populations, and its contemporary, sort of global politics. Creates really different contexts around the world. It's fascinating to think about a Bolivian perspective on this, right, where you at least nominally have the nation state identifying with the interests of its indigenous citizens, as opposed to Native American communities, which, well, wow, we just got Deb Haaland as Interior Secretary, but otherwise, feel drastically unrepresented by the nation state and actually assert their own sovereignty, of course, as the principal mode of nationalism. But where most of the archives controlling huge amounts of their patrimony are under the rubric of either the nation state or legal frameworks like NAGPRA, which incorporate private institutions like mine into the nation state, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, in very systematic ways, where federal funding is what determines your obligation to follow that, law in returning funerary artifacts and the like, and human remains. So that's one thing. I don't think we have time to really break that down here, but it does sort of hover over this a little bit. Is what's the model of development? What's the model of sovereignty? What's the relationship between archives and institutions and state power in any given context? And then, in the international relation context, the other thing that occurred to me, actually, I intended to start off talking about this, and then I didn't. Right now, as we speak, this pandemic is a crisis for indigenous communities, especially those with languages that are endangered, as the expression goes, because of the loss of elders that's going on. This is really an issue in Native America, a very big one, and in Alaska Native communities, where the pandemic may be resetting some of the priorities and making more urgent some kinds of priorities than others in real time for communities where I work. And I think that's something we all want to think about. All of a sudden, the documents we do have of contemporary elders become even more important because there's less time with fewer of those elders left. And so just something to think about. That archives may have a place to play in the global response to this pandemic, especially for formerly colonized and indigenous communities.
All right, any last words from Noel or Vic, or shall we close there?
I'll just very briefly just add to Erin's point and link it back to these two questions and say the work of Black Power Station in relation to ILAM. The thing that seems really important about, say, Black Power Station's self-archive is it's intergenerational. Everything they do has children in there, has elders in there, academics and artists. And as Erin said, the same thing. I mean, the community is being hard hit by COVID, like so many places. And there's this there is a rush to kind of self-archive. And also, I think an argument could be made that the archive is remarkably well documented, better documented than Hugh Tracy's archive, because there's so many WhatsApps and recordings and everything in there. They understand the importance of orality and documenting orality at the same time, you know. So the intergenerational mode seems hugely important.
All right. Yeah, Vic.
One last thing, addressing Vanessa's, she asked about the just, I guess, weighted manner to do this. Very interesting question. And I think I would point everyone here that there's, I believe it's the Cambridge Festival of Ideas. Something's happening in a few weeks that my colleague, Mark Gergis, who is an Iraqi American, who is creating a Syrian cassette archive, literally an enormous project. And he has thought about this question enormously. How do I go about creating the Syrian cassette archive? It's going to be a digital online archive. And he is going to be interviewed on this panel for the Festival of Ideas. And I highly recommend you tune into that, because I've sat with him for hours going through the legal, all of it that he needs to go through. And I've heard all of his thinking and issues. And I know he has still some confusions, but a very good roadmap that I think might form a good model again for people who create an archive. The Syrian situation is of course different from many situations, but I think nonetheless it is, because of how tricky it is, there might be some very useful information or approaches that I think everyone could to learn from, and it's a good ancillary to this talk.
All right, I think that we will close there. Thank you all for coming. This was, I think, by far the best attended event that we've had. So it's really great to see that so many people are interested in this question.